I came back to church for my father's memorial, hoping to sit quietly, pray, and leave before old wounds could find me. But in front of nearly 200 people, my mother stood up and said, I was not worth praying for. I froze with my father's anchor pendant in my hand, too ashamed to defend myself. Then an old veteran at the back of the church saw the burn scar on my wrist and slowly rose to his feet. Before we begin, comment below what city you're listening from, and if this story speaks to your heart, please subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The rain had been falling since before sunrise, thin and cold, the kind of November rain that seemed to soak into the bones before a person even stepped outside. By the time I walked into St. Mark's Community Church in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the hem of my black coat was damp, my shoes made quiet marks on the old stone floor, and the air inside smelled of wet wool, candle wax, and coffee from the fellowship hole downstairs. I had told myself the entire drive over that I could do this. I had told myself that I was no longer 12 years old, no longer the girl standing in a hallway waiting for a mother who would not turn around. I was Lieutenant Sarah Walker. I had stood on the deck of a ship in storms that made grown men go silent. I had given orders with alarms screaming overhead. I had learned how to keep my face still when everything inside me wanted to break. But standing in that church, beneath the stained glass window of the Good Shepherd, I felt younger than I had in years. I felt like a child wearing an adult woman's coat, pretending she had not come home, hoping for something she knew she would never receive. My father's photograph rested near the altar, framed in dark wood, with a folded American flag beside it, and a small arrangement of white lilies. Thomas Walker looked younger in that picture than I remembered him now. He was smiling in his navy dress uniform, his eyes steady, his shoulders straight, the kind of man people trusted before he ever said a word. After the Navy, he had become a volunteer firefighter, because staying safe had never been his gift. Running toward danger had. He died doing exactly that, carrying a child out of a burning house while the roof came down behind him. I was 12 when they told me. 12 when I learned that heroes did not always come home. 12 when my mother, Elaine Walker, stopped looking at me like her daughter and started looking at me like a reminder she could not forgive. That morning, though, I had not come to reopen old wounds. I had not come to argue or defend myself or make anyone uncomfortable. I had come because Pastor Daniel Whitmore had written me a letter in careful blue ink, saying the church would be holding a memorial service for my father, and that he believed my presence would have meant something to Thomas. That one sentence had undone me. My presence would have meant something to Thomas. I had read it 3 times in my apartment before folding the letter and placing it beside my father's anchor pendant. Now that pendant rested beneath my blouse, warm against my skin, hidden from everyone but me. I kept my fingers near it as I sat 2 rows behind my mother and my younger sister, Megan. Neither of them had saved me a seat. Neither of them turned around when I came in. Megan's blonde hair was curled neatly over the collar of her cream coat, and my mother sat beside her with a tissue already in her hand, though the service had barely begun. From the outside, they looked like grief. Familiar, acceptable grief. The kind people understood. I sat alone and tried to breathe evenly. Pastor Whitmore spoke gently about service, sacrifice, and the kind of love that did not count the cost. Every word seemed to land somewhere deep in my chest. I kept my eyes on my father's photograph because if I looked anywhere else, I was afraid I would see pity, or worse, curiosity. When the pastor finally asked the congregation to bow their heads and pray for the Walker family, I lowered my eyes. For one fragile second, I allowed myself to believe the room might become merciful. Then I heard the wooden pew creak in front of me. My mother stood. At first, I thought she needed help. My body reacted before my mind did, the old instinct rising in me. Stand up, step forward, fix what is wrong. But she did not sway. She did not reach for the pew. She turned toward the congregation, her tissue clenched in one hand, her face pale and composed in a way I knew too well. "Pastor," she said, and her voice carried farther than it should have. "I don't think everyone in this family deserves prayer today. A stillness moved through the church. I felt it before I understood it. Heads lifted. Someone coughed once and then went quiet. My stomach tightened. My mother did not look at me right away. That was the worst part. She let the silence gather first, let the room lean toward her. Then her eyes found mine. "Sarah is not worth praying for," she said. The words did not sound loud, but they filled every corner of the sanctuary. She left this family years ago. She chose herself. She abandoned her mother and sister, and now she comes back dressed in black as if grief makes her faithful. She has been nothing but selfish, nothing but a disappointment. For a moment, I could not feel my hands. I could see them resting in my lap, but they looked separate from me, pale against the dark fabric of my coat. Nearly 200 people sat around us, people who had known my father, people who had once brought casseroles to our porch after he died, people who had watched me grow up and vanish and return. No one spoke. Megan stared forward, her mouth pressed into a small line. Not surprised, not horrified, only waiting. I wanted to stand. I wanted to say that my mother was wrong. I wanted to say there were years of bank records, years of late-night phone calls, years of checks sent home when I barely had enough left for myself. But shame has a strange weight when it comes from the person who gave birth to you. It does not strike like anger. It settles. It presses down on the lungs. I reached for my father's pendant beneath my blouse and closed my fist around the anchor until its edges dug into my palm. My sleeve slipped back as I moved, exposing the faint burn scar that crossed the inside of my wrist. I barely noticed, but someone else did. At the very back of the church, beyond the rows of turned faces, an older man with burn scars along one side of his face had gone completely still. His eyes were fixed on my wrist, then on my face, then on the anchor chain disappearing beneath my collar. Slowly, gripping the pew in front of him, he began to stand. Before the old man at the back of the church could take a full step into the aisle, before I could understand why his eyes had locked on the scar across my wrist, something inside me slipped backward through time. Maybe it was my mother's voice still hanging in the sanctuary. Maybe it was the smell of rain on wool coats, so close to the smell of the wet turnout jacket they handed my mother the night my father died. Or maybe grief has a way of folding years together until a woman in her 30s can suddenly feel 12 again. I was 12 when Thomas Walker became a framed photograph instead of a father. Until that night, I had believed certain things with the simple certainty only a child can have. I believed my father would always come home. I believed my mother's hands would always be warm when they touched my face. I believed that if a person did the right thing, the world would at least try to be fair in return. My father had been the center of our small house on the east side of Cedar Rapids. He was not loud, not the kind of man who needed to fill every room with his opinions, but somehow the room always changed when he entered it. He noticed things. If I was quiet at dinner, he noticed. If Megan had a nightmare, he noticed. If my mother had been crying in the laundry room, he would not embarrass her by asking in front of us, but later I would see him standing beside her at the sink, shoulder to shoulder, saying something low enough that only she could hear. He had served in the Navy before I was born, and after he came home, he worked long hours and volunteered with the fire department because he said a uniform was not something a man took off just because his duty changed. At 12, I did not fully understand that. I only knew he smelled like smoke, soap, and wintergreen gum, and that when he called me my steady girl, I felt as if there was a place in the world made exactly for me. The fire that took him started in a small house not far from the river. I learned the details in broken pieces, mostly from adults who forgot children could hear through walls. A child was trapped upstairs. My father went in with another firefighter. He got the child out. Then part of the roof came down. That was all anyone ever said in front of me. He saved the child, and he did not come back out the same way. People filled our house for days afterward. They brought casseroles wrapped in foil, paper plates, sympathy cards, flowers that made the kitchen smell too sweet. Everyone kept telling my mother how brave Thomas had been, as if bravery could sit across from her at breakfast or fix the broken hinge on the back door. At first, My mother cried. Constantly. Then, little by little, she stopped crying where anyone could see. Something colder took the place of her grief. Not anger, exactly. Not at first. More like distance. If Megan climbed into her lap, my mother held her so tightly, Megan would sometimes squirm to get free. If I stood nearby, waiting, my mother would look past me as though I had asked for something unreasonable without saying a word. I used to think I had done something wrong. I replayed whole days in my head, searching for the moment I had become difficult to love. Later, I understood that I reminded her of him. I had his dark hair, his careful way of answering before speaking, his habit of standing still when frightened instead of running away. To my mother, Megan was the child she could protect. I was the child who looked too much like the man who had left her by being noble. That was when the rules in our house began to change. Megan was allowed to fall apart. I was expected to hold steady. If Megan cried over homework, my mother sat with her. If I brought home an A, she said, "Good, keep it up." If Megan forgot a chore, she was tired. If I forgot one, I was careless. By 14, I knew how to make meatloaf, pay attention to the electric bill, sign Megan's school forms when my mother forgot, and keep my own sadness quiet enough that no one had to deal with it. I became useful. In our house, useful was almost the same as invisible. The only thing of my father's that truly belonged to me was the silver anchor pendant he had worn on a chain beneath his shirt. My mother gave it to me without ceremony, as if it were one more item she could not bear to look at. I found the note months later in a small box of his things, folded behind an old Navy photograph. The handwriting was his, steady and slanted. An anchor does not stop the storm. It keeps you from drifting. I read that line so many times, the paper softened at the creases. I did not know then how many storms were still waiting for me. I only knew that, inside the house where my mother held Megan close and let me stand alone, I had to become my own anchor. By the time I turned 18, I had learned that silence could become a language in a house. My mother spoke it every time she looked through me instead of at me. Megan spoke it when she left her dishes in the sink, her school papers scattered across the table, her small failures waiting for me to clean up before my mother noticed. I spoke it too, though I did not understand that then. I spoke it by doing what needed to be done without asking whether anyone cared that I was tired. I spoke it by folding laundry at midnight, by finishing homework after everyone else had gone to bed, by telling myself that needing less made me stronger. When the Navy recruiter visited our high school, I did not think of it as escape at first. I thought of my father. I thought of the photograph of him in uniform, the way his shoulders had seemed to carry purpose instead of weight. The Navy looked like distance, discipline, and a place where being steady might mean something other than being used. So I signed the papers, passed the tests, and told my mother at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, while Megan scrolled through her phone beside a half-empty bowl of cereal. My mother did not cry. Somehow that hurt more. She set down her coffee cup and stared at me as if I had confirmed what she had always suspected. "So you're leaving us too," she said. I remember the word too, the way it slid between us like a blade. I wanted to say I was not my father. I wanted to say he had not left her because he wanted to. I wanted to say I had been here for 6 years, standing in all the places she refused to stand, carrying all the things she would not name. But I was 18. And I still wanted my mother to bless me, even if I would never have admitted it. Megan looked up long enough to say, "You always did think you were better than us." That became the story they told. Sarah left because she thought she was too good for Cedar Rapids, too good for her family, too good for the house that had raised her. The truth was simpler and sadder. I left because if I stayed, I was afraid there would be nothing left of me to save. Boot camp did not frighten me the way people expected it to. The yelling, the schedules, the exhaustion, the inspections, none of it felt easy, but at least the rules were clear. If I failed, I knew why. If I succeeded, someone said so. That alone felt almost luxurious. Over the years, I built a life piece by piece. I learned to sleep lightly, wake quickly, follow orders, then give them. I earned a commission through a Navy program while serving, and eventually I became the kind of officer people trusted in a crisis. I was not fearless. That was never true. I simply learned how to keep moving while fear stood beside me. Still, no matter how far the Navy carried me from Iowa, my family found ways to reach through the distance. The first time my mother called asking for money, it was for a car repair. She sounded embarrassed, and that softened me. I sent what I could. A month later, it was the electric bill, then a missed mortgage payment, then medication after a hospital visit, then Megan's community college fees, then her rent, then a credit card balance my mother insisted was temporary. Each time, I told myself it was not about gratitude. It was about keeping the house standing. It was about honoring my father. It was about not becoming the kind of daughter my mother already believed I was. But giving becomes dangerous when the people receiving it start calling it duty. My mother rarely said thank you. Sometimes she would text, "Got it," as if I had delivered a package. Megan was worse. She joked once that military people had steady government money, as if deployments were a convenience and loneliness came with benefits. Over 13 years, the transfers added up to more than $120,000. I knew the number because one rainy evening, sitting alone at my small apartment desk, I went back through old statements and added every payment by hand. I stared at the total until the digits blurred. I did not feel generous. I felt hollow. Then, the letter came from a bank I did not use. At first, I thought it was junk mail. Then I opened it and saw my full name, my social security number, and a loan balance of $47,000. My hands went cold in a way I remembered from childhood. The account had been opened with an old address in Cedar Rapids. There were signatures that tried to look like mine and did not. I sat there for a long time, listening to the heater click on and off, feeling something inside me shift from hurt into clarity. I printed everything: bank records, transfer receipts, mortgage confirmations, tuition payments, medical bills, the loan notice, not because I wanted a scene, not because I wanted to shame my mother or Megan. Pastor Whitmore's letter about my father's memorial was already on my desk, and I decided I would go home, honor my father, then ask them quietly to tell me the truth. Even then, after all those years, some part of me still wanted to give them the dignity they had never given me. After I printed the bank records, the transfer receipts, and the loan notice with my name on it, I should have felt ready to face my mother and Megan. Instead, I sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the faint scar across the inside of my wrist. It had faded over the years into a pale, uneven line, easy to miss unless the light caught it a certain way. Most people who noticed it assumed it came from some ordinary accident, a kitchen burn or a childhood fall. I never corrected them. The truth belonged to a cold evening 8 years earlier, during a short leave that was supposed to give me a few quiet days away from duty, away from orders, away from being needed by anyone. I had been driving through Des Moines after visiting a former shipmate, taking a route I barely knew, when I saw smoke rising behind a row of older apartment buildings. At first, I thought it was a chimney or someone burning leaves where they should not have been. Then I saw people gathering on the sidewalk, faces tilted upward, hands over their mouths. A woman was shouting into a phone. Someone else kept pointing toward the second floor. I pulled over before I fully understood what I was doing. The air outside smelled sharp and bitter, the way it had smelled on my father's jacket when he came home from fire calls. For 1 second, I was 12 again, standing in our kitchen while adults whispered words they thought I could not hear. Then a man's voice came from above, muffled but unmistakable. "Help me." It was not dramatic the way movies make it sound. It was thin, frightened, human. People were yelling that firefighters were on the way, and they were right. Sirens were already growing louder in the distance. But the smoke at the second-floor window was thickening, and the voice had become weaker. I remember thinking that there were moments when waiting was wise, and moments when waiting became a choice a person would have to live with. My father had once told me, courage was not the absence of fear. It was deciding that someone else's need mattered more for the next few seconds. I did not feel brave when I ran toward the building. I felt terrified. I felt angry that I was terrified. And beneath both of those feelings, I felt something older than thought, something my father had left in me without asking. The stairwell was already hazy when I pushed inside. Heat pressed against my face, not unbearable yet, but close enough to warn me that I had very little time. I kept low, one hand against the wall, my sleeve over my mouth. The hallway upstairs was worse. Smoke blurred the doors until they looked like shadows shifting in front of me. I called out, and the answer came from the end of the hall, behind a half-open apartment door. Inside, I found an older man on the floor near a couch, coughing hard, one arm braced against a coffee table as if he had tried to stand and failed. His eyes were wide with panic. "I can't," he kept saying. "I can't get out," I told him he could, because I needed him to believe it before I was sure I believed it myself. I got my arm under his shoulder, pulled him up as far as I could, and told him to stay low, to breathe through the cloth I pressed against his face. He was heavier than I expected, weak in a way that made every step feel like dragging both of us through mud. Behind us, something cracked loudly, and he froze. I remember snapping at him, sharper than I meant to. "Don't stop. Stay with me." Later, I would hear that voice in my own head and recognize my father in it. By the time we reached the hallway, my lungs were burning and my eyes watered so badly I could barely see. I used my coat to shield his face as best I could. At the stairwell, he stumbled, and I caught him against the railing. That was when my wrist hit something hot, maybe metal, maybe the edge of a door frame. Pain flashed bright and immediate, but there was no room for it. Pain could wait. The man could not. Firefighters met us near the lower landing, rushing up through the smoke in full gear, their voices firm and controlled. Hands took him from me. Someone guided me outside. The cold air struck my face so hard I nearly cried. A paramedic wrapped my wrist, asked my name, asked if I needed to go to the hospital. I remember giving short answers and looking past them toward the man on the stretcher. His face was turned away. I could not tell if he knew I was there. I could not tell if he would live. I left after they treated me. Maybe that sounds strange, but at the time it felt simpler than staying. I was on leave. I was used to doing what needed to be done, and then moving on. I did not want questions, praise, or a local news camera catching me with smoke in my hair and my hands shaking. More than that, I did not want to call my mother and hear indifference on the other end of the line. So I told no one. Not Elaine, not Megan, not anyone in Cedar Rapids. The burn healed, the scar stayed. Sometimes, when I looked at it, I wondered whether the man had survived. More often, I wondered whether my father, wherever his soul had gone, had seen me run toward the smoke and understood that I was still trying to be his steady girl. I did not decide to go back to Cedar Rapids all at once. For several days after Pastor Whitmore's letter arrived, I left it on my desk beside the printed bank records and pretended I had not already made my choice. The envelope was cream-colored, the church address written in careful blue ink, the kind of handwriting that made even an invitation feel gentle. He wrote that St. Mark's Community Church wanted to hold a memorial service honoring my father's life, his Navy service, and his sacrifice as a volunteer firefighter. He wrote that several people in town still remembered Thomas Walker with gratitude. Then, near the end, he wrote, "I believe your father would want you there." That was the line I could not get past. Not my mother wanted me there, not Megan, not the church. My father. I folded the letter and unfolded it so many times that the crease began to weaken. I told myself I was too busy. I told myself going back would reopen wounds I had spent years learning how to bandage quietly. But beneath every excuse was the same truth. If there was one person I would still cross a storm for, it was my father. So I booked the flight, packed a black coat, slipped the anchor pendant into the small pocket inside my blouse, and placed the folder of documents in my carry-on. The folder was heavier than paper should have been. Inside were years of transfers, mortgage confirmations, tuition payments, medical bills, and the loan notice for $47,000 that carried my name, but not my consent. I did not pack it because I wanted revenge. I packed it, because after the service, when the lilies were cleared away and people had gone home, I planned to ask my mother and Megan to sit down with me. Quietly, privately. I still believed, foolishly or faithfully, that truth could be handled with dignity if everyone in the room cared enough not to make it cruel. Cedar Rapids looked smaller when I returned, though I knew places did not shrink just because the people who left them changed. The streets were wet from a cold Sunday rain, the lawns brown at the edges, the trees nearly bare. Driving past the old neighborhood, I kept my eyes on the road and did not turn toward our house. I was not ready for the porch where my father used to sit after dinner, or the garage where his tools had hung in careful rows, or the kitchen window where my mother used to stand before grief made her unreachable. At Street. Marks. Cars already filled most of the lot. People moved toward the entrance under dark umbrellas, shoulders hunched against the wind. I sat in the rental car longer than I needed to, one hand on the folder, the other pressed against the anchor beneath my blouse. I reminded myself of the plan. Walk in, honor Dad. Stay calm. Speak to them afterward. Do not let old pain decide the shape of the day. When I finally entered, the warmth of the church touched my face, carrying the smell of coffee, rain-soaked coats, and polished wood. For a moment, I almost believed I could get through it. Then I saw Megan near the front, surrounded by women I half recognized from childhood. Her hair was curled, her cream coat spotless, her expression soft in a way she had perfected for public sympathy. "It's been hard," she was saying, one hand resting lightly against her chest. "Mom and I have done everything alone for so long. Sarah sends things once in a while, but she's never really been here." The women made the small, sorrowful sounds people make when they think they are hearing the full story. My mother stood a few feet away, listening. She did not correct Megan. She did not say that the mortgage had been paid because I sent money from 3 time zones away. She did not mention the hospital bills, or Megan's tuition, or the calls that came only when something was overdue. She simply lowered her eyes, as if the lie itself had exhausted her. I could have stepped forward then. I could have opened the folder and ended the performance before it gathered strength. Instead, I stood near the back of the sanctuary and let the moment pass over me. It was my father's day. That was what I told myself. Not theirs, not mine. His. I would not turn his memorial into a courtroom because Megan needed an audience, and my mother needed a version of me she could blame. So I found a seat 2 rows behind them and placed the folder flat on my lap beneath my folded hands. Pastor Whitmore began the service with a prayer, then spoke about service as something measured not by applause, but by what a person was willing to carry when no one was watching. I looked at my father's photograph near the altar and felt my throat tighten. For a few minutes, I was able to forget the whispers. I remembered his laugh, his wintergreen gum, the way he called me his steady girl. Then Pastor Whitmore looked toward our pews and said, gently, "Let us bow our heads and pray for the Walker family." I lowered my eyes. The church grew quiet. Then the pew in front of me creaked. My mother stood, tissue clenched in one hand, her face pale and composed. "Pastor," she said, her voice carrying through the sanctuary, "I don't think everyone in this family deserves prayer today." My pulse dropped into a strange, hollow silence. She turned just enough to look at me. "Sarah is not worth praying for," she said. And this time, behind those words, I felt every year I had spent trying to be a daughter to people who only knew how to use my silence. For a moment, after my mother said it, no one moved. The words seemed to remain above us, suspended in the warm church air, too cruel for anyone to touch. I could hear rain tapping softly against the stained glass. I could hear someone shift in a pew behind me. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, though I was trying with everything in me to make it quiet. My mother stood at the front, with her tissue in her hand, her face arranged into grief, as if she had not just opened me in front of nearly 200 people. Megan sat beside her, eyes lowered, but not with shame. She looked almost relieved, as if something she had wanted said aloud had finally been said by someone else. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to stand. I wanted to be 12 and 31 at the same time, wanted my father to step out of his photograph and put a hand on my shoulder. Instead, I sat frozen, my fingers still curled around the anchor pendant beneath my blouse. My sleeve had slipped back, exposing the pale burn scar along my wrist. That was when I heard the slow scrape of wood at the back of the sanctuary. At first, I thought someone was leaving because the moment had become too uncomfortable. Then I saw him. An older man was standing in the last row, one hand gripping the pew in front of him, the other wrapped around the handle of a cane. The left side of his face and neck bore old burn scars, the skin tightened and uneven, but his eyes were clear. He was not looking at my mother. He was looking at me. Pastor Whitmore turned toward him, surprised but gentle. "Mr. Hayes?" he said. The name meant nothing to me. The man took one careful step into the aisle, then another. His walk was slow, not theatrical, not demanding attention, but the room gave it to him anyway. Every head turned as he came forward. "I knew Thomas Walker," he said, his voice rough but steady. Not well enough to call him a close friend, maybe, but well enough to know the kind of man he was. We were both Navy men, and we saw each other at veterans' breakfasts over the years. I came today to honor him. He stopped halfway down the aisle and swallowed. His eyes moved from my face to the chain at my collar, then down to my wrist. But I did not know until this moment that I had another reason to be here. My heart began to pound in a different way, not from humiliation now, but from recognition I could not yet explain. He looked at me as if he had been carrying a memory for years and had just found the missing name. 8 years ago, he said, there was an apartment fire in Des Moines. I was trapped on the second floor. I had fallen, and I could not get myself out. The hallway was full of smoke. I remember thinking I was going to die there. A faint sound moved through the congregation. My hand tightened over the pendant. A woman came in after me, he continued. She had no gear, no mask, just a coat over her mouth and more courage than sense. She got under my arm and told me to stay low. She told me to breathe through the cloth. When I froze, she snapped at me like an officer and said, "Don't stop. Stay with me." My chest went still. I had not thought anyone remembered that. I had not thought he had known enough to remember me at all. "She burned her wrist, pulling me through that hallway," he said. "I saw it happen. I saw her flinch, but she did not let go. Because of her, I lived long enough to meet my first great-granddaughter. I lived long enough to bury my wife properly. I lived 8 more years that I was not supposed to have." He reached the front pew then, only a few feet from me. My mother's face had gone hard and pale. Megan stared at him as if he had walked in, speaking a language she did not understand. Robert Hayes turned toward the church. "So before anyone in this room decides who is worth praying for," he said quietly, "you should know that this woman saved my life." Then he lowered himself, slowly and painfully, onto one knee in front of me. The sound that passed through the church was not applause. It was not outrage. It was something deeper, a collective breath finally released. I shook my head once, unable to speak, wanting to tell him not to kneel, that I had only done what anyone should have done. But he looked up at me and said, "Some thanks are too heavy to give standing." That was when the silence changed. It was no longer the silence that had protected my mother's lie. It was the silence that waits for truth. I reached into my folder with hands that no longer shook. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse with anger. I simply began to read. Mortgage payments sent from overseas, Megan's tuition, Elaine's hospital bills, utility shut-off notices I had paid before anyone in town knew they existed, emergency transfers, insurance premiums. More than $120,000 over 13 years. Then I held up the bank letter. "And this," I said, "is a $47,000 loan opened in my name without my permission." My mother whispered my name like a warning. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, the warning did not work. "I will not discuss this in anger," I said. "The bank will handle it. The law will handle it. But from today forward, I will not send another dollar to support a story that turns my sacrifice into abandonment." No one interrupted. Not Megan. Not my mother. Not one person in that church. For the first time, the truth stood in the room with us, plain and unadorned, and there was nowhere left for anyone to hide. No one moved for several seconds after I finished speaking. The church that had felt so full of whispers when I walked in now felt almost empty, as if the truth had cleared out every easy opinion people had carried with them. Robert Hayes was still beside me, one hand on the pew as he slowly stood again, and Pastor Whitmore looked as though he wanted to say something but knew the moment did not belong to him. My mother was the first to break the silence. "Sarah," she said, and my name in her mouth sounded less like love than control. I turned toward her, still holding the bank letter in one hand and the folder in the other. For one brief, foolish second, I thought she might apologize. I thought maybe shame had finally reached the place in her that grief had frozen years ago. But her eyes were not soft. They were bright with anger. "Do you realize what you've done?" she whispered. "You embarrassed me in front of the whole church." That was when something inside me settled. Not broke, not burned, settled. For most of my life, I had believed there would be one sentence that could fix us. Maybe, "I'm sorry." Maybe, "I was wrong." Maybe, "You were always my daughter." I had built whole years around the possibility that if I became useful enough, patient enough, generous enough, my mother would finally look at me and see more than the ghost of the man she lost. But even after Robert's testimony, even after the receipts, even after the lie had been dragged into daylight, all she could see was her own humiliation. Megan began crying beside her, but the sound did not reach me the way it once might have. I knew that cry. I had heard versions of it when bills came due, when she needed tuition money, when she wanted my mother to take her side. "Sarah, please," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't just cut us off. Mom can't handle this. I can't handle this." She did not say she was sorry. She did not ask how I had carried all of it alone. She did not even deny the loan. She only looked at me as if I had taken something that belonged to her. I stared at my sister and realized that Megan had never truly believed I was a person with limits. To her, I had been a distant account that answered when called, a shadow who made problems disappear, a sister useful enough to resent but necessary enough to keep. Around us, people began to stand, quietly, awkwardly, unsure whether to comfort us or leave us alone. I did not wait to find out. I placed the folder back under my arm, touched the anchor pendant beneath my blouse, and walked down the aisle without asking anyone's permission. My mother called after me once. Then again, I did not turn around. Outside, the cold Iowa rain was still falling, fine and steady, silver under the gray sky. It touched my face like something cleaner than tears. I stood beneath the church awning and breathed in the damp air. And for the first time that morning, my chest did not feel locked. Behind me, the church doors opened. I expected Elaine. I expected Megan. Instead, Robert Hayes stepped out slowly, leaning on his cane. "Lieutenant Walker," he said. I turned, and he gave me a tired smile. "I meant what I said in there." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He told me he still had contacts from the veterans community and that he would help file a formal statement about the fire in Des Moines. He said the Navy should know what I had done, even if I had never asked anyone to know. I tried to tell him it was not necessary, but he shook his head. "Some truths arrive late," he said. "That doesn't make them less true." A few weeks later, an envelope came to my apartment. Inside was a copy of the statement Robert had sent, along with supporting details from the old fire report. But it was not the paperwork that made me sit down at my kitchen table and cry. It was the note he had written by hand at the bottom of the page. "Your father would have known exactly who you became." I held that paper for a long time. Then I reached for the silver anchor at my neck and let it rest in my palm. My father had never promised me a life without storms. Maybe no loving parent can. What he had left me was something quieter and stronger. The belief that I did not have to drift just because other people refused to hold on to me. My mother never became the mother I waited for. Megan never became the sister I kept trying to save. And the church, for all its silence and shock, was not the thing that healed me. The truth did not give me my childhood back. It did not make the years of loneliness disappear, but it gave me back my own name. I no longer needed Elaine to call me worthy. I no longer needed Megan to admit what I had carried. I no longer needed to pay for a place in a family that had mistaken my sacrifice for weakness. The anchor had never stopped the storm. It had only kept me from losing myself inside it. And when I finally walked away, I did not leave as the daughter they had abandoned. I left as the woman who had chosen her own dignity. Looking back, I no longer believe miracles always arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes God sends them quietly, through a stranger standing up at the right moment, through a scar that finally tells its story, through the courage to walk away from what has been breaking you. In everyday life, we may not stand in a church before hundreds of people, but many of us know what it means to give silently, to be misunderstood, and to keep loving longer than we should. May this story remind you that your worth is not decided by those who fail to see it. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs strength. Leave a comment about what stayed with you, and subscribe for more stories of faith, family, and healing. May God bless you and protect your home.